Hi, welcome to Just in Canada and our series on Canada's social changemakers. My name is Justin Douglas, and today I'm here with Matthew Hayes. Matthew is an academic and a film critic. He's an award-winning writer and journalist. He is a professor at Concordia University here in Montreal, where he teaches film studies, communications, and journalism. He's also done a lot of writing, both here in Canada and abroad, for the Globe and Mail, the Vancouver Sun, the New York Times, and the UK Guardian, and Vice, just to name a few. So thank you, Matthew. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to Just in Canada.
Thank you.
So the reason that we chose media as sort of our launch topic is because we're an alternative media station, and so we want to sort of discuss what the state of media is in Canada today, and what better person than a journalist from Canada. So you've mentioned that Canadians don't necessarily trust the media, and that maybe there's a sense of anger towards the media. Can you describe what that anger is and maybe what the implications are for the relationship of Canadians to corporate media?
Well, right now we have, with the obvious exception of Toronto Star, most of the media in Canada, that would be, I think, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, Maclean's, the Post media chain, is right-leaning.
Okay.
So that's actually out of step with most Canadians. Most Canadians are actually pretty lib-left,
Right.
moderate. They're either
Right.
voting Liberal or NDP. So they're either center or center-left or
Right,
left.
right.
So, in fact, I would argue, many people on the right argue that there's a liberal bias to the media. That was a Republican thing that they thought up years ago to keep repeating this over and over and over again about the liberal bias of the media. And it worked really effectively because basically a whole bunch of people in journalism said, well, we better do our best to bend over backwards not to look liberal. We better have as many right-wing guests as we can. It was a very brilliant passive-aggressive move because it really worked fabulously among some not very bright journalists who simply went right to in the other direction to prove that they weren't, communists. And so in Canada, it's interesting, we hear that liberal bias myth. But if there were really that many angry conservative Canadians out there, then Sun News would have been a huge sensation and everyone watched it. And practically no one watched Sun News, and it died an embarrassing death. So.
I do remember I was on Facebook and I saw very quietly this little blurb, Sun News has shut its doors, and that was it. There was no other media coverage on it. So that was also interesting to see that how they even respond to right-wing media sort of not being successful in Canada, and contrasting that also with CBC, Radio Canada, and this idea of public versus private, and we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Well, I'm from Alberta, so I know both the people who are watching Sun News.
All two of them. Yeah, exactly. So in 2013, in a Guardian piece that you wrote, you said Canadians view much of the world through American media. So maybe can you elaborate on that, and what are the implications of having so much American media always filtered through to us in Canada?
Well, I think it gives us a bit of a complex, doesn't it? I mean, we're always going to be a little brother or a little sister to America and to Britain. I mean, it's part of being a colonized country.
Right.
So if something appears in the New York Times or the Guardian, we're very, very sensitive to how we're being portrayed. And that's partially also because Americans, it's a one-way looking glass. Not only are we inundated with American media, but Americans know very little about Canada.
Hardly anything.
No, hardly anything. So that adds to the whole complex that we have. It's a very, it's an interesting way to think about Canada and to look at it from that perspective. It's one of the reasons why it's interesting to write about Canada. I think the idea that people think we're boring is actually a myth. I think people are actually really sensitive to how Canadians see things, because we are kind of seen as the better version of America, the nicer version of the United States.
For a long time we were. I don't know if that's still necessarily the case with sort of how our politics have evolved over the last 10 years, but certainly we have that self-perception, and whether that's still true or not remains to be seen.
I think people still think of us, as I wrote in the Washington Post and the Guardian, I think that people still see us as through the lens of a Michael Moore film, this kind of quasi-socialist utopia. And, and so it's kind of interesting to talk to other people about what Stephen Harper has done to the country. And when he goes to the United States, his first stop is usually Fox News, where he gets an interview. So he fits right in there.
How do we as Canadians then maintain our own values and our own identity when we're constantly being bombarded by this American corporate media narrative? And how do we find our own voice within that?
Well, that narrative right now is one of that a lot of Canadians are disgruntled with the Harper government. So in fact, the narrative that, for example, the closing of the Canadian mine, the piece that was in the New York Times last weekend, now the narrative is much more that people are increasingly unhappy with Stephen Harper's leadership and with the Conservatives running the country, despite the fact that they got a minority. Only 39% of people voted for them. So
39% of eligible voters of people who chose to vote, because as we know, there's a huge percentage of Canadian population that choose not to participate.
Who are helping him to get elected. Yes.
Exactly.
So I would certainly urge everyone to get out and vote.
Are there certain, I don't know what the answer is, but is there a way for Canadian alternative media, regular media, to somehow take more control? Like I know the CRTC, we have a certain Canadian content mandate that we have to see, but still with this barrage of constant American corporate media, how do we identify ourselves as Canadian and as separate from that?
Well, that's a really complicated question.
Of course.
You know, I mean, I'm not quite sure how we do that. I think that the idea of a strong, properly funded, independently operated CBC was a great start. It was a great voice for Canadians, and the idea that we would have a media that is not completely beholden to advertisers. I know Patrick Watson, who was head of the CBC and was one of the creators and hosts of this Hour 7 Days, the quite radical 60s CBC TV series, he always said it was a really bad idea for the CBC to invite advertising in. I mean, a lot of the CBC used to be run without ads.
I remember,
They started inviting advertisers in to sponsor those programs. And he said, you know, this is a really bad slippery slope we're going down, because now the private sector can say, well, should government subsidy be going to the CBC? They're doing exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
And it also meant that when there was a recession, as there was in 07, 08, the most recent recession, which we're still not recovered from, of course, that then when the downturn in advertising happened, the CBC was hit extremely badly. So it's one of the reasons why we've had all these cuts. So I think we probably need to revert to a model where the CBC has a strong source of funding, that we recognize the importance of having a government-funded, independent media source, and one that doesn't have to worry about corporate sponsorship or advertising revenue.
The CBC has been criticized, though, because of government funding, that perhaps sometimes it acts as a mouthpiece for the government of the day. How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, I think it's really the opposite. It's usually the criticism I hear. The Conservatives just hate the CBC and made CBC attacks kind of a sport, as you see at some of these Stephen Harper rallies. I think that if anything, the Conservatives should be thanking the Liberals, or thanking the CBC, because the extensive coverage that the CBC did of the sponsorship scandal brought down the Liberal government. That's why their support collapsed in Quebec, and they haven't really recovered since then. So that opened the door to the loss of Quebec support for the Liberal Party, which then led to a Conservative victory and eventually a Conservative majority. So I don't know why the Conservatives are always so angry with the CBC. The CBC did a pretty, I think, unbiased job of covering that scandal.
So you've written about Rob Ford for the UK paper The Guardian. Maybe can you contrast your experiences and your perceptions a little bit about writing articles about Canadians for Canadians and writing articles about Canadians for non-Canadians?
Well, obviously, it's just an issue of context. If you're writing about a Canadian situation or a Canadian issue in an American or British newspaper, you just have to contextualize it. Certainly, I noticed that perhaps there's a little bit more of a sense of adventure in, especially at The Guardian. The Guardian will let you go a little bit crazy if you want, or come up with an unusual idea. It's a little different. I find the editors in Canada maybe a little more straight-laced.
Interesting.
Yeah, I find The Guardian more adventurous, but it's a fun newspaper to read, and a lot of unusual ideas in there. Like if you come up with a sort of strange angle on something, they really like that at The Guardian.
Okay, and what's the sort of reaction been from non-Canadians to your Canadian pieces? Have you received much feedback?
Yeah, I do. People say, isn't that interesting? But I think more than that, I think that when you write something in The Guardian about Canada, then it's the overwhelming response is a lot of Canadians are either really angry with you or think it's kind of funny and get that you were making a joke or not.
Okay.
Then there's a huge response from Canadians.
So going back to Rob Ford for a second, you've mentioned that he is crude, swaggering, bungling, irrational. is this a symbol of what Canada has become? Because, I mean, does this describe what we've really become as a country? Is this how other people perceive us?
Well, I think it's how a lot of Canadians perceive what we've become.
Yeah.
I wrote that sort of at the height of Ford mania, when he was really spinning out of control, and there were scandal after scandal. But I was sort of trying to tie Ford in to talk about Ford's connections to Stephen Harper and to the fact that our policies under Harper were often have been quite unthinking when he's been asked to explain what policies are, like the tough on crime agenda, which has been completely disproven in the United States, where they locked up record numbers of people. It hasn't brought down the crime rate, it hasn't helped to finish the problem of crime or fix the problem of crime. But when his ministers have been asked about this, they just simply say, well, it's CBC propaganda, or they refuse to actually discuss it on any real level. So it's this sort of post-reality politics. It's working really well for Donald Trump right now. It's just tap into an emotion and speak in platitudes and catchphrases, and don't really analyze anything to any. Just divorce yourself from reality. And unfortunately, I think that that's part of what's happened in Canada. And I'm really hoping that when the election comes around, that we will move on from this government. I think it's been a very bad 10 years for Canada.
Is there anything else we can do, government aside? Because as much as the government represents us as citizens, we still have our own voice. What can we do to regain our self-respect internationally, government voting aside?
Well, I think people have to think locally and globally, and act locally and globally as well. One of the things that is really important to keep in mind is that if the federal government isn't doing very well, we can still act at a municipal level and a provincial level. So, for example, Rachel Notley now is the Premier of Alberta, the first NDP government. That's huge. I didn't think I'd see that happen in a long while. That's happened. She's a very progressive person. That's going to be a progressive government. They're going to face a lot of tough times because the Alberta economy is so wound up in oil. That's going to be an interesting challenge, one of the many challenges that they face now. But you see at a municipal level, when you have progressive people running places like Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver. A friend of mine in Edmonton was a city councillor there for many years, an openly gay city councillor, Michael Fair. And one of the things that he fought for in Edmonton was school lunches, which helped disadvantaged children who might not be getting a proper meal at the end of the day. They would at least get one proper hot meal per day with the hot lunches program that he pushed for with the mayor and implemented that. So there are things we can do at different levels. I don't think we should think it's all over if we don't have exactly the person we want running the federal government. I hope that people will be good cynical, but not bad cynical. We need to be cynical about what our government is doing. We need to look at them with a very critical eye and not trust everything that they say. Too much cynicism, of course, means people just say, well, it doesn't matter who's in office, and people simply stop voting, which is what we're seeing an epidemic of among young voters, which is really a very bad sign. I think it's really a responsibility as well as a privilege to be able to vote. You've got to think about places in the world where people can't vote. So I hope people will get out on October 19th and actually, even if I don't agree with them, if they'll just vote, you know.
So let's talk about the government a little bit. You've called the Liberal Party, who is not the current government, but the Moderate Party, and the NDP the left-wing party, characterizing them both as the sanity vote. Do you think people still identify with these right-left cleavages? Are Canadians, maybe especially younger Canadians, less identified with ideology and perhaps maybe more concerned with good economic and social policy?
Well, people who say we're in a post-ideological world and I'm not right or left-wing, if you ask them a few questions about social policy and economic policy, usually, they do usually sort of seem to swing more to the right or to the left. Canadians are an interesting bunch in that we tend to be pretty fiscally conservative but pretty socially liberal. Usually it's an interesting combination of things. But I think among younger voters, and this has caused great anxiety with the Republicans in the United States and with Conservatives in Canada, younger voters have had a lot of their views shaped by people like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert. So they're actually quite critical of right-wing thinking and are usually identify with, if not the left, then with the center-left. This is a crisis for conservatives in North America. Younger people don't really see a lot of their policies as being very beneficial. It was right-wing thinking that got us into this deregulation mess that happened over 25 years that meant that everything that people was doing on Wall Street was actually legal, and they were ransacking the economy and doing extremely risky things with money. It's one of the reasons we're still in the midst of a global financial crisis as a result of what happened in 07, 08 in Wall Street, started by the wealthiest white-collar people who had rigged the system so that all of the deregulation was done so they could do whatever they wanted. Subprime mortgages, hedge funds, all sorts of ridiculously risky things that they were doing. And that's part of the reason we're in the mess that we're in now.
So things like trickle-down economics, privatization of public services, of public spaces, doesn't necessarily work in Canada's best interest. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, trickle-down economics don't work in anyone's interest, and it's really the cruelest joke that's ever been told that I can think of. The idea that if the 1% becomes wealthier, that they're going to spread that wealth around. It's become unbelievably clear to anyone who looks at it. Even right-wing economists have had to acknowledge the distribution of wealth is a huge threat to democracy. It enhances almost any problem you can think of, from human rights to global warming, climate change. All of these things are made much worse by the uneven distribution of wealth. And that's only become worse since 2007, 2008, since that meltdown. So the irony is that the wealthiest people started this mess, and they've only become wealthier since it all collapsed.
So we've talked about it a little bit, but maybe you can expand on your thoughts of democracy, how we address civic engagement, increase civic engagement, how we get people to care about the upcoming election.
Well, I think it's tricky, and it's a lot of dismay, I think, in the electorate in Canada, because we do have this government that's been really pushed the country into a very different direction. Stephen Harper said he really wanted to shake up Canada and make it a new and different place, and he's done that. He's been very effective at doing that. But he's done so with 39% of the vote. So other voters are really, really angry and really unhappy at what he's done. It does remind me of when Bush somehow managed to win the White House, but because of the Electoral College system hadn't actually won a majority of the votes in 2000. Gore had won the majority of the American votes. So many people felt that not only was Bush doing things that they didn't like, but that there was an illegitimacy to his having taken the White House. And so I sort of feel like sometimes I look at Stephen Harper and think, well, you really don't have the will of the majority of Canadians haven't supported you and don't agree with what you're doing, and yet you're taking the country in a remarkably different direction. You're doing things that will take probably decades to turn back, to change back to what we had before. So I think it's an uneasy time for a lot of people. I just hope that people will not be so cynical that they neglect to get off their ass and vote on October 19th.
So let's talk about the upcoming election. What do you think the parties are doing right at this point? What are the parties doing wrong? Where could they improve?
Well, it's hard to gauge right now what's going on, because the Mike Duffy affair is a complete disaster for the Conservatives. Every night, the first 10 minutes of the nightly national newscasts are taken up with what's happened in the trial. I can't think of a worse scenario for our government. If Mike Duffy wins the trial, somehow is victorious, he's still a Harper appointment, so it looks bad for them as well. If he loses, it looks terrible for them as well. It's bad all around. I think that all of the pharmacies around, I would bet all of the pharmacies around Conservative Party headquarters are completely sold out of Pepto-Bismol. This is about as bad a thing as you can live through in a campaign. You do not want this going on in the nightly news, and people who say they aren't panicking are lying or delusional, because I can't imagine a worse thing to be going on when you're trying to win re-election.
What about the opposition parties? The NDP, the Liberals, successes, failures?
I think that both parties, both Mulcair and Trudeau, are doing a pretty admirable job. Trudeau still makes the occasional gaffe, which kind of plays into the Conservative ads about him not quite being ready. I think that when he says we grow the economy from the heart, that seemed a really kind of an odd quote for him to be making. So he is still a little bit vulnerable, but Mulcair is doing a good job. I think that the ongoing Duffy affair, Duffy scandal, the trial, the NDP all along has said that we should get rid of the Senate. They've always said that. They've been saying that forever, that it's an unnecessary part of government and we should abolish it. So when the scandal goes on, people, if they think back, will remember that the Liberals did a lot of pork barrel appointments. There was a lot of cronyism, favors to friends, putting them in the Senate, that kind of thing. And the Conservatives, of course, said they would abolish it, but then turned around and stacked the deck in their favor. The NDP de facto just ends up looking like the best party in terms of the Senate scandal. So, and certainly they wanted to pick up more votes in Quebec, and as I was reading the other day, if an election were held right now, it would be a tsunami for the NDP. It wouldn't just be an orange wave. It would be incredible. They would win a lot of votes. So still, we've got several weeks before this is all over. We've got a ways to go, and that's an eternity in politics, as they say. So we'll see what happens.
Are you concerned about vote splitting at all?
Oh yes, I lose lots of sleep over vote splitting. I think that's really a concern. And when I talk to Liberal supporters, they really think that a middle-of-the-road party is best. And when I talk to NDP supporters, they say, well, anyone who votes Liberal is just voting for more conservative policies, and you're kind of a traitor to the left if you're voting for the Liberal Party. So again, we're seeing people getting entrenched into those camps, and we'll see what happens. I will be voting strategically for sure. I'm going to be looking very carefully at the candidate who is most likely to win against a Conservative in my riding, and I would hope people would do the same thing.
What do you see as the future of media? Is it going to be more corporate control, or do you think that there's going to be more spaces for independent voices?
Well, that's the $60 billion question. I don't know. It's very, very hard to say what's going to happen. I think the egg that needs to be cracked is what the next business model is. People are struggling to find that. The New York Times erected a paywall and had metered content, and that's met with mixed success. I don't know why the digital advertising has proven so lackluster in comparison to print advertising, for example. So I think we're gonna have to see how that works out. We're seeing certainly like something like Canada Land, where you have crowdsourcing, funding a media organization. That's an interesting model to see, and I'm intrigued by what they've done. Some of these organizations risk blowing up their own bubble. I think that's something they've got to be a little bit concerned about. I think that BuzzFeed seems to be doing well and Upworthy. These sites are attracting investors. So is the Huffington Post. But at the end of the day, whether or not these they can turn over the kind of profits that newspapers used to 30 or 40 years ago is yet to be seen.
I'm also interested because most of these new voices still remain private voices, and so there's a particular perspective that comes out of that. And so I guess I would also be interested to hear your thoughts on the private versus public media. And as an independent voice, can you really have a public voice if you are a private broadcaster?
Yeah, although in the United States, most of it's private. It's been private for a long time. Those are privately run companies. Part of the difficulty is the newspapers, because they were making a lot of money in the 60s, they went public in the 60s and 70s, so that you could have stock, you could sell stock, and you could make more money. But then what that meant was the newspapers were beholden to stockholders, which meant they were expecting to see 20 or 30% profit annually. Well, at the turn of the century, being 1900, there were many newspapers that made 1% profit a year, or not even that. Sometimes they lost a little bit of money. It was prestigious to own a newspaper. So putting the news media solely in hands of people who needed to profit from it every year, stockholders, has done terrible things to news gathering and journalism. In the same way that making our nutrition beholden to stockholders was really a bad idea. We ended up with people eating McDonald's and hypotension and type 2 diabetes and all of the poisons that McDonald's has put into our food system. It's the same way if you read that book, Fast Food Nation. It really does analyze a lot of the ways in which, and illustrates quite clearly the way in which that had done great damage to the diet of the average American. And we have to think of information diets the same way. If it's just left to profit, we're going to end up with, nothing but kitten videos. Nothing against kitten videos, but that's not all we want. And I don't know, the latest news from the Kardashians.
Well, that's what we're trying to do here, hopefully, is to raise the conversation a little bit across Canada, and you've certainly given people a lot to think about today. So I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. hopefully people in Canada will enjoy what they've seen and think a lot about what's coming up over the election and our future here. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me.